Well, hello. We are here today to record the oral histories for Where History Meets the Road, celebrating Route 66 and Colorado Boulevard, the Pasadena Museum of History's exhibition on view June 13, 2026 through January 24, 2027. It is 3:22 on May 13, 2026. In the room, we have Lyle Johnson as videographer, Natalie Riddick as interviewer, and we are here today with Dominique Moody. How are you today?
Hello. Hello, Natalie.
Wonderful. First question I have for you is, how old are you?
This year, the end of the year, I will turn 70.
Wonderful. And where did you grow up?
I grew up in so many places. I was born abroad in Germany in the mid-50s, and we came back, or the family came to the States. That was my first time, since I was born abroad, to the East Coast. And the Philadelphia, New York area. So I grew up mostly in Philly, and then I went to school very young, at the age of 15. I was an emancipated minor in New York City, going to school. I went to Pratt Institute for Art.
And what started your journey as an artist?
My journey in art was from I cannot remember a time when that wasn't a part of my kind of thinking and experience. But I think it was certainly shaped by having to do the transition as a child between a place I knew to a place I did not know. And I felt that there were some language challenges because I was mixing two languages, and neither one of them in the 60s seemed to be truly appropriate. So I decided that my art would be the language, that I would convey my feelings, my thoughts, and my communication, my conversation.
Wonderful. And what brought you through your art to California?
You know, living on the East Coast, it can be really rough, and in the 70s it was really rough, especially New York, and especially as someone under the age of 21. And so I decided, after family moved to California, and they would tell me about this amazing place, and it was Northern California, it was the Bay Area. And so my mother and oldest sister moved to San Francisco, following in the footsteps of an older brother who was in the military out here. And I decided, what would I have to lose? And like so many people, particularly African Americans, often disillusioned by the experiences that they were having. The West seemed like there were some possibilities, and so I came out by car.
Wow. What was that physical journey like, driving across the country?
It was amazing. It was amazing to see the country. I unfortunately was also found to be undocumented due to my birth abroad. And I did not know. I applied for a passport because in my bones I feel I must travel. And so traveling cross country was absolutely fascinating. I came with a family friend and everything she owned and my little bit of what I owned. And that was the big journey. And I really, since I could not travel outside of the country, traveling within the country, to me, was, a really wonderful opportunity. Yeah. And coming to California, wasn't sure what to expect. The only thing I knew was mostly by what I read or saw on television. So San Francisco was really different.
Yeah. And Did your travel inspire your art?
My artwork tends to take me places and both pull me and draw me to places. So, you know, I think it's always the lead. San Francisco was an interesting place to go at the time because there was a real growing arts community there. And I felt at home. I also felt I could possibly, the notion of living as an artist seemed more possible in California than it did at the time in New York.
Yeah. And how did this journey bring you to Southern California?
Southern California, it was almost 20 years in Northern California before I decided at 40 to make a big leap. But what my art pulled me into that decision. I received an invitation to do my first major solo exhibition at the Watts Towers Art Center. And I had visited Southern California numerous times in the 20 years of being up north and was fascinated by Southern California, but I wasn't sure how I would fit, how I would make that transition to LA. When I received the invitation for the solo exhibition through Mark Greenfield, who is an artist that lives in Altadena now, he said, whatever you'd like to do, and I'll give you a year. So I moved from Oakland to Washington, D.C., where as an artist, I could actually be a guest and not have to pay rent for a year to do a body of work. That wasn't able to happen up north, but I had friends in D.C. Being this person who's dual coast is a really interesting thing, but it also means that when you do find a place that you want to be, it is by choice. I have explored a lot of different aspects of the country, and LA was drawing me to it. And so I came to Southern California by way of that. I spent 1 year in DC, created a whole body of work, and then shipped that work to the Watts Towers Art Center, and then decided to stay.
Wow. What was it like seeing your work at the Watts Towers Center?
It was phenomenal because when I first came across the Watts Towers Art Center and the towers themselves, I said, here is a region and a city and a neighborhood that embraces art. Because to me, it was the epitome of being able to state a full expression, one that took decades in the making, and a neighborhood that even if they didn't always understand it, they allowed an artist the freedom to do it. And that is very different in other parts of the country. And so, especially urban spaces. And so I really felt that there is something special here that I wasn't seeing in other areas. I've lived in more than 7 states, more than 12 cities, and 3 countries. And so having, to say that LA would be my home it was a big decision and a good choice.
Wow. And how did you end up in Altadena, and had those connections that led you to presenting art over here?
Well, I was coming into the Watts Towers Art Center just as John Otterbridge was retiring and leaving. And that was real interesting to go to a center like that, an art center based in a community, and through Mark, get introduced to an entire community of artists. That is not typical in most cities, that you get introduced that way. I was not from here, but did this show, and one of the first people I met was John Otterbridge. But through that, also Betty Saar, Charles Dixon, just the most amazing artists that you now go into museums and you see their work. And it was a phenomenal thing to be then embraced by a whole arts community, in particular an assemblage arts community.
Wow. Tell me more about your relationship to John Otterbridge.
Yeah. John, even though he had retired, was still so much a part of the center. And he, of course, knew everybody. But I think more than anything, it was just his spirit of how, he will speak and talk, the conversations that we would have. I think he was really intrigued with my work and the fact that there aren't really a lot of women assemblage artists in the field at that time. I think it's grown since then, but it's typically kind of more dominated by men. And I think he was fascinated the approach that I had to the material, to the ideas, and to the way of life. And so we had great conversations. And I think his most intriguing thing, too, when we met, is I told him about an encounter I had in LA, of all places, of a wild bluebird that would actually visit my home and fly into the house. And he thought that was so astounding. And so we talked about the ways in which the natural environment and the urban setting, because he grew up in more a rural southern experience, what that was about, and his encounters. He had chickens and all kinds of animal life in Pasadena. And so he started telling me about the places he's been and the homes he's had here. And so we would go on these little day trips. He had a vintage, beautiful 60s Volkswagen kind of bug or Beetle. I'm not sure which era it was referred to as, but he would restore classic cars and vehicles, and so he had this beautiful car, and of course it sounds like it's run by a rubber band. So whenever it's in the neighborhood, John's coming, and it was just wonderful to spend a whole day. And so one of my first real introductions to Pasadena was to do a trip with John, and we had come out in the car, and he knows the streets so well that he did cut through the back streets of LA to come in to Pasadena. And so we weren't on the freeway, but we did cross the Colorado Boulevard Bridge. And it was just an incredible bridge to see, to be coming into Pasadena that way. And at one point he found a way to get to the lower streets and just below the bridge, and there's a kind of walkway. And we walked around up underneath the bridge. And in his classic way of storytelling and just, his voice and the way he will describe a narrative or a scene. And he described the history of this bridge. And I was fascinated by that. But in these long rides, we would talk about just about anything and everything. And one of the things he talked about was his experience coming to Pasadena and making the choice to come to Southern California. We have something in common. I was born in 1956 in Augsburg, Germany, and he was leaving the military and his German experience there also in 1956. And so in a strange way, we cross paths. And, he's certainly, a generation, before me. But the fact that just as he's leaving, my family is coming in, I thought was really serendipitous. And so he went to Chicago. And in Chicago, he was a bus driver. And he said many of his artist friends were going to California and going to Southern California in particular. And he decided with his young wife at the time, Beverly, to join that trek. Now, in the 60s, he's still then part of the wave of the Great Migration that lasted into the 70s. And we talked about that. What's that experience like for him to be part of that enormous transition and migration of Black people to a place where we felt our hopes could be met. And so those kinds of conversations were had as we were driving through and coming to Pasadena. And then, of course, we would, take Fair Oaks, then up to Altadena, to his family home area. But he also took me to get introduced to the Zorthian Ranch, meeting with Alan Zorthian, the son of Girard. He would take me to the bookstore, I think is Romans, is it? So it's a great bookstore. And so there were just all of these wonderful experiences. The Rose Bowl flea market we went to a number of times. And as assemblage artists, it's like in a candy store when you're around a whole lot of stuff. And we enjoyed those immensely. But I felt, too, when I would be driving with him, people would recognize him and the car all the time from the street. And they would call out Bridge. And so his name, Outer Bridge, which is an unusual name to begin with, conveyed this other element of who he was within the community, within the city. And to me, he was literally a bridge. Mm-hmm. For me, he was a bridge into the arts community, and particularly the African American arts community here in Southern California. He was also a bridge to the fact that I've, also East Coast. And he was definitely a bridge to the community, and especially Watts. And so I felt that the name was so appropriate. But as metaphors go, back to the Colorado Street Bridge and the fact that it was this beautiful place that was both about, the admiration of its beauty and the love of that, the unusual kind of crescent shape that it has, that it also carried this burden of a despair. It was a bridge where people had lost hope and ended their lives. And so I felt that that combination of the spectrum of what a place holds was really powerful, and he would talk about those things. And I always started to, in our conversations, we would look at things with that spectrum, that things that may happen in your life is a spectrum, that both the really amazing joy that can happen in your life, but also the deep sorrows. And I felt that push in terms of exploring that just in conversation also pushed and explored that in my art. His art had already been doing that, and his way of storytelling. And I started to do similar kinds of overlays of storytelling, both in my art and as an accompaniment of my art.
Wow.
That was really important. And so even Route 66 and his experience, he wanted to take it, like so many other people at that time, to take that journey. But for Black people driving through more than 2/3 of the country, and driving through certain areas and spaces, most people don't realize that more than half the stops along Route 66 were sundown towns. And that is a stunning fact, and even to the point where the Green Book then did a special issue so that Black people on that journey could navigate to safe spots. And so while John didn't linger on those particular challenges, he did remark that here he was driving this incredible classic car from Germany that he had shipped over. He had restored it there and shipped it, and what that meant to be a Black man driving that kind of distance in a classic vehicle like that. So, I feel that stories always have deeper ends to it than what we most see on the facade. And it's always, to me, then important to bring those out, both in my art, but also in my story sharing.
Well, it's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing. Would you be able to tell me more about how that experience and relationship with John inspired one of your art pieces?
Yes. He introduced me to Rick Lowe, who is an artist architect out of Houston, Texas. And Rick Lowe had started an amazing program, and he had come out to kind of garner with a larger arts community, both what he was doing in Houston and inviting artists out there to be a part of this kind of residency program he had. And here he was, kind of combining art and architecture together. So John went out first, and he was invited very early on, and he did this wonderful piece called, I think it's 29 Rhymes in a Row, which is a piece that's part of the permanent collection at the California African American Museum. And so John was telling me about his experience there, and considering he grew up in Greenville, North Carolina, living in what was referred to as a shotgun house. That Project Row House in Houston was familiar to him. And so I was always intrigued by architecture and by particularly vernacular housing, houses that were hand-built. And I have lived in more than 40 of them, houses of every kind, every sort, both homes, apartments, what have you. And so we would have these great conversations about architecture. And so he felt that what Rick Lowe was doing was really important. I then received an invitation from Rick Lowe to come out and do a piece. My mother was living in Houston at the time, and I thought it would be a great conduit. I had also met lots of people in LA who are from Texas, who are from New Orleans, and so there was this interesting kind of crossover culture-wise. And so I did a piece called Sweat Equity. And at the time, it was a structure that was both collage and assemblage. And it is in the shape of a house, and certainly reflects what, like Rick Lowe has done, is he kind of shifted the name from it being Shotgun House to Row House. And that's because culturally that house was so distinctive, but that to name a home space after a weapon, that was not our name giving. And there are historical reasons why it got that name. And like, once again, this spectrum, that spectrum rarely gets talked about. But it's one of violence and threat, and not about a home. And so when I went out there, I had this whole house to do an installation in. And while John couldn't join me, at the site, he really was intrigued by the piece I installed there. And to talk about these things, about the ways in which we look and perceive home. I had lots of conversations with him about the way he perceived his family home. And then this idea of this kind of architecture. And so that's an example. That piece is still with me. And when I came back from Houston and realized that that was around 2005, that LA was changing. And LA was changing to the point where it was becoming really more difficult to afford to live in the city. I have always, as an artist, found creative ways to approach being able to live in a city, whether it was New York, San Francisco, or LA. And at that point, too, I didn't feel I could come into a place, a community like Pasadena, that it was not really attainable. But I did feel that I was starting to meet people who lived in Pasadena and Altadena, and what that community was. And so that's when we did a lot of these trips back and forth to meet folks in Altadena and Pasadena. But when I decided to do the Nomad, and the Nomad perhaps then is the sweat equity piece was the precursor, the Nomad was the full expression. And I had to figure out a place to build it. And this was in 2009, 2010. I did a group show with John at the California African American Museum. He titled that show called An Idea Called Tomorrow. And each artist was to look at how they perceived what might be the future called tomorrow. And mine was a tiny house inspired by the row house on wheels. That what I found is that I love going to places. What I did not particularly feel that I wanted to do all the time was remake home over and over again. And so he encouraged me, because I was, for the first time, shared this idea with him that had been in my head since my late 20s. And I had turned 50 when we started coming to Pasadena. And so it really helped to have another artist say, this is an amazing work of art as much as it is a necessity for your creativity to help resolve. And so that's what I did. And so now, when he introduced me to Zorthian Ranch, that's where I became an artist in residence at the Zorthian Ranch. He introduced me to Side Street Projects and Emily Hopkins, and therefore I ended up doing a residency with her once the Nomad was done. But she was a great support, and they offered me support throughout the build. And I did some of the art nights with Side Street Projects, also in connection to Funky Junk Farms. And so here was this new community that I was now becoming very much steeped in order to do one of the most pivotal pieces of my art. And it speaks to my own personal migration, my family's migration, and in the larger realm, the great migration of how African Americans move and migrate in the country.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. Could you tell us more about this pivotal art piece that encompasses your story?
It took, the Nomad took 3 years to build. It is literally built on a car hauling trailer at the time. At the time I was working on it, there was no tiny house movement. And when I first thought about doing it in the 80s, there was definitely no thought. And the reason I kind of shelved the idea was because of my eyesight change. I had had 20/20 sight, but having grown up on the East Coast, typically driving is not the first thing. And so you tend to drive rather late. And so I had never driven, but with 20/20 sight, I did not think that that would be an issue until my sight started to deteriorate. And so I've lost 60% of my sight. And most of that is all central sight. What I have now is 40%, which is just my peripheral, which is why, I can see certain things, but not others. I see what most people think of seeing out of the side of your eyesight. So I can see spatially, but I have no depth of field. So everything is kind of flat. And so I have to determine where I am just so that, I can move around in the dimensional world. But that has made for an amazing visual art shift. And I feel that my art is stronger now because of it, that it actually has gifted me a different kind of sight. And I've learned so much from it. And even though I miss people's faces, I was a portrait artist. I did high, realism rendering. And while I miss aspects of that, what I have gained in lieu of that is a much deeper way of connecting to people, of articulating thought and figuring out little nuances of how people communicate other than by what you see. And so when he basically told me that this is a remarkable piece, that you must do it, but the one thing you might have to do that is going to perhaps be a little uncomfortable is that the project is so large that you might have to bring in other people. And that's a difficult thing for artists, because trusting a broader scope of people on an idea that you have can be risky. And you want to hold on to the integrity of what you're doing, and you don't want to lose sight of that. It's not necessarily a collaboration in the full sense. It's more of a support network. And I was able to find that he introduced me to Lynn Kienholz. And Lynn Kienholz introduced me to the Anawalts. And the Anawalts, who live in Pasadena, Bill and Sasha Anawalt. Bill owns the first of the Anawalt lumber yard stores and supported the raw materials. And Sasha Anawalt, at the time, was a professor at USC and in art journalism. And so there became this growing network of support that allowed that to happen. He introduced me to Alan Zorthy, and that's where I did the raw build up there, because it was land that would allow it. It's a ranch, and so, taking the risk to both build something that is fully functional, but is a mobile artist in residence, and it is aesthetically made of all of these found materials, but also had to be registered fully for the road. And so when I took it to Pasadena DMV, on the phone, I tried to tell them what is coming. This house on wheels that was hand-built and took 3 years to build, and it was built like an art piece, so there are no plans. And they said midway, if you got to register it, just bring it in. I don't know what you're talking about. Just like everybody else, just bring it in. And so we brought it in and realized it would not fit where it needed to be, and that they would have to come out to it. And when they did, they nearly fell over. All 6 inspectors were all vying to get the sign off on this thing. They said we had never done one. we're not even sure what to ask, but we want to see how well it's built. And so I showed them my drawings of after, but all the steps that it took to build it. And they allowed it to be fully registered for the road full-time, which most tiny houses are not. And it was just an incredible journey to do this. I am not an architect, I'm not an engineer, but I have an affinity with houses. I've had to work a house many, many, many times. And all my art speaks about housing. And so to build one, and to build one that meets all my needs, and is aesthetically, beautiful and articulates both a personal but also a very public kind of story, is extraordinary. And it's still in process. And it's being pulled by a 1950 Ford F5. I think most of the people now think of a truck as an, F500 series. Mine is the granddaddy of it, and that's still in process too. I have toured it all around the Southern California, Altadena, Pasadena, Los Angeles, all the communities. It went back to Watts, and it went to Santa Monica, and then it went out to Joshua Tree. And I was there as an artist in residence doing land works. I had no studio any longer, just being in the residency. And then I took it to New Orleans for Prospect 4 in 2017, 2018. And then it returned to Side Street Projects for an artist in residency up until 2020 and the pandemic.
Yeah. Wow, thank you for sharing. That's so beautiful. Your work connects so well to these celebratory themes of celebrating Pasadena, Route 66, and Colorado Boulevard, and knowing that your work has traveled these roads, and the idea of bringing home with you on the roads. That's really wonderful. Can you tell me more about your experience working with Side Street Projects in Pasadena?
Side Street Project was amazing because, I became very focused about any art-related project that was mobile. And I really felt that there is something very important about the mobility of art to go where it's needed. And so Side Street Projects was something that grabbed my attention very early on. I've been, throughout my experience in Southern California, an arts educator. Due to my eyesight, I was not easily going to be able to be certified as a full-time teacher. But I decided that actually was okay, that I preferred to go into many different kinds of school settings and to come in as an artist. And that actually was really wonderful because I could shape programs differently than if I was literally within that school system, and especially assemblage art. And so I brought in these programs that the schools had never had the ability to explore. And so I had the teaching background. And so when I would, see what Side Street Projects was doing and had a chance to speak with Emily, and we had lots in common, and she's from Baltimore, and so there were all of these kind of really nice overlapping elements. The working with wood And so these school buses that were converted to a whole new kind of school that's mobile, I was fascinated by. And so I was delighted when I was invited to be a part of it. But that's also after kind of all the connections that we had kind of building up to actually working in a residency with them. So, you know, they were very helpful with the build, and I got a trailer that I was able then to stay in up there at the ranch from Side Street. And so, you know, when the Nomad came back into LA and she invited me to do a residency with them. Now, I couldn't stay in the Nomad because, number one, they were located at John Muir High School, and so I couldn't be on the school grounds. But the Nomad was placed there. And I then stayed with a whole variety of people over almost maybe 18 months, with a variety of people living in different parts of Altadena, Pasadena, and over by the school, or over by the bookstore. And so it was interesting being a guest in different places and parts of Pasadena. But what I proposed for Side Street projects is that I wanted a wood project, and one that people could utilize those skills both at home but also in this piece. And people had responded to the Nomad in such a, they were so drawn to it that it was important to, in a sense, leave a little bit of Nomad behind. And so they had on their site a little, I think someone donated, you know, like it's maybe a 12-foot trailer with just a set of single axle wheels. And so it was like a little mini Nomad. And I decided that one of the things I was noticing as I would walk around the city and the neighborhood were, I love the architecture in both Pasadena and Altadena, and especially the craftsman style houses, the bungalows, the bungalow courts. But what you were also starting to see is that people were switching out aspects of the home to update it, modernize it. So on the street, you would see piles of old windows, doors. And I, you know, for me as an assemblage artist, those are materials for creation. And so I proposed that we create out of all these salvage windows and doors that the community itself would bring and help gather a mini greenhouse on wheels. I love the fact that both Pasadena and Altadena are such green spots, that the trees have almost a sacredness to their being here and being present. It is so important to have lived in an environment like the Zorthian Ranch that is definitely an intersection between the wild and the urban and a neighborhood. And so having had that experience, I wanted to kind of bring that into the project by way of, even with community gardens, there are sections of community that either can't afford it, don't have time to go to a community garden, or can't physically get to them. And so to create a mobile mini garden that can go to community instead, and that what it can foster is this idea that green space can happen on the micro level in a small container, that you could still grow something beautiful that will bloom, or grow something that is healing like an herb, or grow something that is edible. And so this little micro greenhouse catered to that kind of more micro gardening. And that the community will help design it and shape it by using these salvage windows and doors. And so that's what we did. So we would have these public workshops, and it was free to the public. And we would do things like show how to reglaze a window that they would bring in. We would say, if you have a window, you can bring that and donate it for the project. And then how to actually repair windows so that people could go home and glaze their windows if need be, remove a broken pane or cracked pane, so that there was a real impact for the community to have a skill set that they can use in their own home. Or that if they had these extra windows, that they could also craft art out of them. And everything from picture framing, family photos and behind a window, or painting on the glass. And so whether it was children who were there for the day, they would do other collage type projects. And so we actually fashioned the concept of it using collage. But as we were building it, we decided we needed to name it. And so we battered some ideas around, and we ended up coming up with our Garden of Dreams. Because as we were talking to people, whether they were seniors or disabled people who want more of an experience in a garden setting, but couldn't physically get to it, then we wanted to think in terms of that this was something that can come into your life that can help meet a dream. But it's a long title, Our Garden of Dreams, so we shortened it down to OGOD, and then realized it actually spelled out, oh God. And so we, would refer to it in this way. And it is now, because it was at John Muir, the fire did not have an impact on it. And the pandemic did have an impact in that it delayed some of the detail completion. I did a mural all around it. And so it is now complete, but because it was saved, it went up to the ranch. And so it's now currently part of a larger garden that is being resurrected at Sorthian Ranch. And it's helping to create seedlings for planting in this larger garden. And to me, that is the importance of my art. It's not just the making of it, but the life and kind of power it has after I've created it. It has its own particular life to lead. And it tends to go into places I might never expect. But that's when I know it's done, is when it's doing its thing.
Wow. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate that look forward into the future of, of what the project will continue to do for Pasadena, Altadena, and all around as a mobile project. So it's really wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today.
Can I add one more thing?
Of course.
You know, when the fire hit, I was scheduled to place the Nomad at Freeze LA. And then the fire. And what was happening is less than 24 hours before the fire, Tammy Otterbridge picked me up because from my studio in LA to deliver to her home 3 works of art that she had purchased of mine. And then the fire. Those 3 pieces are gone. But more importantly, the impact on so many people I knew, homes I had lived in with them, communities, and it was so impactful to think about it. I almost, you know, it was a given that Nomad was built here, built in Altadena. And as its birthplace, that has an important factor. But it was never so powerful of a birth story than when that fire hit. And when that community was impacted the way it was. I almost wanted to withdraw from Freeze. There was just too much emotional kind of upheaval to kind of deal with. But I approached Freeze since everything was in the works, and when they decided after the conversation of whether they should continue having it, that they would, that it was important for me that the Nomads speak to this birthplace that it's connected to, and the people who helped make it happen. It's just like Watts Towers and Simon Rodia's Towers. Without that community, it would not have happened. And I feel the same with the Nomad. Without the Pasadena, Altadena support, it would not have been made. And therefore, people coming to this big art event from all around the world needed to know how important an arts community in this region, how that art gets to them. And it gets to them through community and support, and that's how then they're able to see it at an international fair. And so on my sign, it was this dedication, and it talked about Zorthian Ranch, Side Street Projects, Funky Junk Farms, John Otterbridge, and the family. And so recently, because of the connection that I've had to that family, the Otterbridges, the Route 66, the vintage truck that pulls it, the bridge, I have been in conversation with the Armory to be a part of their fall exhibition. And so you might see me there.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Wow. Thank you so much. This was a great conversation. We really appreciate you sharing your stories with us. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.